I remember that night vividly, the dimly lit bar filled with the chatter of hopeful singles mingling, each searching for something meaningful amid the clinking of glasses. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of anticipation and skepticism. As I sipped my drink, my attention was captured by William. Despite the initial buzz around him, his presence seemed overshadowed by his subdued demeanor. When it came time for introductions, his voice barely carried over the murmurs of the crowd. "The most important thing to me is family," he stated, a simple yet profound declaration that resonated with me deeply. Intrigued, I maneuvered through the crowd, positioning myself next to him, eager to delve deeper into the conversation about his values. Our chat began with tentative exchanges, the typical awkward pleasantries of two strangers trying to find common ground. But as the evening wore on, the superficial layers peeled away, revealing more about our lives, our dreams, and importantly, our shared value of family. It was refreshing to meet someone who prioritized familial bonds as much as I did. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Our relationship blossomed rapidly, fueled by our mutual commitment to family values. When William proposed, it felt right, it felt destined. The wedding was a beautiful affair, surrounded by those we loved most, and I was elated to begin this new chapter with him. However, the euphoria of our nuptial bliss was short-lived. The first sign of trouble came subtly, initially through offhand remarks and small criticisms from William that I brushed off as stress from his job. But the real issues surfaced when his mother, Isa, became involved. Her influence over him was undeniable and deeply rooted, something I hadn't fully grasped until she began inserting herself into our daily lives. The incident with the dish was a breaking point. That day, I had spent hours preparing a special meal, hoping to bridge the growing gap between Isa and myself. Her reaction was not just a rejection of my cooking, but a blatant dismissal of my place in the family. "Are you keeping livestock in this house? This must be feed for livestock, right? You weren't seriously thinking of feeding this to Billy, were you?" Her words stung as she hurled my effort into the trash, the clatter of the dish echoing my crumbling spirit. The cold, hard reality set in. I was an outsider in my own home, my presence barely tolerated. William's passivity in the situation only compounded the hurt. His once endearing quietness had morphed into a silent endorsement of his mother's cruelty. Each day, the man I married seemed more like a mirage, an illusion crafted from my own desires rather than the substance of who he truly was. Now, with the impending move of his mother into our home, the dynamics threatened to shift even further. William's announcement, delivered with such finality, left no room for discussion. "Mommy is moving in next month. Clean out your room," he demanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. The ultimatum was clear, and his expectation for me to comply without objection was palpable. As I retreated to the sanctuary of my bedroom, the weight of everything crushed me. Yet, beneath that weight, a resolve began to form. I had married a man who believed in the importance of family, but now I saw the selective application of that belief. It was a bitter pill to swallow, recognizing that to him, family meant just one person, his mother. Determined, I resolved to take control of the situation in the only way I could. "As you wish, I'll clean everything out completely," I had told him, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The meaning of my words was dual. While I would physically clear the space for his mother, I would also begin to detach myself emotionally from a relationship that had shown its true, unrecyclable colors. In the quiet of my room, as I began to pack away not just belongings but the remnants of a broken dream, I pondered over what family truly meant. It was more than just blood, it was about respect, support, and love, none of which I felt from William or his domineering mother. My future might be uncertain, but one thing was clear, it would be one where I valued myself enough to walk away from those who couldn't value me. The shift in our marriage was gradual yet unmistakable. From the moment we exchanged vows, the reality of being William's wife began to diverge sharply from the dreams we had discussed during those early, hopeful dates. Initially, the discrepancies seemed minor, a forgotten promise here, a harsh word there, but as time passed, these accumulated into a mosaic of disappointment. William, who had once seemed so gentle and introspective at the party where we met, revealed layers of himself that I hadn't anticipated. His voice, once quiet and reflective, now carried a sharpness in our daily interactions, especially when things did not go his way. This was a side of him that I hadn't seen during our courtship, hidden beneath the surface of his reserved exterior. "Hey Emily, my favorite shirt isn't in the closet. Make sure you take care of it." His tone was demanding, a stark contrast to the soft-spoken man who had talked about the importance of family and respect. It was shocking to see how quickly he could become self-centered, his needs and demands always taking precedence, as if marriage had shifted his expectations of our roles. I responded calmly, trying to maintain the peace. "You told me yesterday to take it to the cleaners, so I dropped it off today. It'll be ready tomorrow." But my attempt at clarification was met with an immediate and intense backlash. "If I told you yesterday, you should have taken it out yesterday, then I could have worn it today. Think before you act." "My mommy would never make such a mistake," he retorted before storming out of the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. His words echoed in the empty room, a reminder of the constant comparisons to his mother, a figure who seemed faultless in his eyes, against whom I was always measured and found wanting. This constant benchmark was exhausting, draining the joy from our marriage and replacing it with a relentless tension. Despite these challenges, I clung to the belief that the love and respect I held for my own family could somehow mirror in our marriage, that William and I shared a foundational respect for what family meant. But as days turned into months, it became increasingly clear that William's view of family was narrowly defined and revolved solely around his mother and her expectations, not the partnership we had pledged to build together. In those moments of reflection, I realized how isolated I had become in my own home, a place that should have been a sanctuary but felt more like a battleground. Each day, I was reminded of the stark differences in our upbringing. I grew up in a family where, despite financial struggles and hardships, we supported each other with smiles and encouragement. Our bond was forged in adversity, strengthened by mutual support and unconditional love, not judgment and comparison. This stark contrast between our family's values and dynamics became a source of continual strain. The man I thought I had married, who valued family as I did, was now a person who seemed to value only the opinions and expectations set by his mother, leaving little room for us to grow as a couple or for me to feel valued as an individual within the marriage. As I packed away my belongings, preparing for his mother's imminent arrival, I was also packing away the remnants of my initial hopes for our life together. Each object placed into a box felt symbolic, a packing away of the dreams I once held so dearly. That morning, as I stood at the threshold of William's room, a heavy silence enveloped me. The sight of William and his mother, ISA, sharing a bed was jarring, a stark illustration of the abnormal closeness between them. While I understood and respected the bond between a mother and her child, the intimacy of their arrangement felt deeply inappropriate and unsettling for a married couple. This incident crystallized the unusual dynamic in our home, emphasizing how deeply William's decisions were influenced by ISA's preferences and opinions, even to the detriment of our marriage's privacy and boundaries. His happiness at accommodating his mother in such a personal manner left me feeling like an outsider in my own home, disconnected from the man I thought I had married. My attempts to discuss setting boundaries were met with dismissal or, worse, outright hostility. "It's fine, Emily. Mommy and I have always been this close," William would say, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The fact that he saw nothing wrong with the situation was a clear indication of how skewed his perception was, influenced heavily by his mother's dominance over his life choices. The decisions about our living arrangements, like the choice to have separate bedrooms and the casual dismissal of the idea of having children based on ISA's whims, were not decisions made by a couple in partnership but imposed by an external force that held sway over William's will. The conversation about not having children because Mommy said kids are noisy and a lot of trouble had been particularly painful. It not only showed ISA's influence, but also highlighted how little my opinion mattered in matters that should have been decided together. Each of these revelations deepened my sense of isolation and disillusionment. As I moved about the house, from room to room, each space felt less like a shared home and more like a battleground where I was slowly losing ground to the overwhelming presence of ISA. Despite my own deep-seated values about family and the shared bond that initially drew William and me together, it became increasingly clear that our definitions of what it meant to cherish family were diametrically opposed. For me, family meant support, love, and mutual respect. For William, it seemed to revolve solely around obedience and deference to his mother's desires. As days turned into weeks, my resolve to maintain my dignity and sense of self within this marriage strengthened. I began to ponder my own happiness and mental well-being, questioning whether staying in a relationship where I felt more like an accessory than a partner was worth the emotional cost. The physical space I occupied in our home had become a symbolic representation of my shrinking presence in our shared life, overshadowed by the looming figure of Isa. Navigating this complex web of familial loyalty and marital obligation, I realized that any potential for a healthy, balanced relationship was being eroded by the unyielding influence of a third party who had no place in the intimate decisions of our married life. As I faced these harsh truths, I knew that difficult decisions lay ahead, ones that would require me to choose between my own happiness and the facade of a family unity that never truly included me. The presence of Isa in our home became a recurring, unwelcome intrusion that blurred the lines between a visit and a takeover. Each time she arrived, it was as though she brought with her a palpable shift in the atmosphere, transforming our space into hers, relegating me to the role of an uncomfortable spectator in my own life. After witnessing Isa and William sharing a bed, my discomfort had escalated into a profound disturbance. The image haunted me, undermining any semblance of normalcy our marriage might have once had. It was clear that boundaries were non-existent in their relationship, and my role as William's wife was superficial at best, overshadowed by Isa's domineering presence. Isa seemed to assert her control not just over William but over our entire household. The day she discarded the meal I had prepared was particularly emblematic of her disdain for my role in the household. "Are you keeping livestock in this house? This must be feed for livestock, right? You weren't seriously thinking of feeding this to Billy, were you?" Her words stung, her actions a blatant disrespect not just for my efforts, but for me as a person. As she threw the dish into the trash, her dismissal of my place in my own home was palpable. In the kitchen, as she prepared another meal, Isa's disregard for basic kitchen safety, using the same knife to cut meat and then fruit, only added to my growing list of grievances. Her lack of consideration was alarming, yet William seemed oblivious, content to consume whatever she placed before him. This disregard for my feelings, coupled with the dangerous laxity in her standards, sent chills down my spine. The financial strain added another layer of stress. William's belief that the money he earned was solely for his personal use left me shouldering the burden of our household expenses alone. This arrangement, dictated by Isa's philosophy that the money you earn is also mine since you're my wife, felt not just unfair but exploitative. Each new expensive bicycle William bought, and the shed he built for them without a word to me, were constant reminders of the financial and emotional toll his selfishness was taking on our marriage. One day, feeling overwhelmed by the constant disregard for my role as his partner, I asked Isa directly, with Isla coming over so often, "Is your father-in-law okay with it?" Her response was dismissive and cold, "That man is on a solo assignment in the countryside. As long as he sends money every month, there's no problem at all." Her words made me feel sorry for the father-in-law, a man who, like me, seemed relegated to the periphery of his own family's life. Isa's visits became more frequent, and each time I returned from work to find her already comfortably ensconced in our living room, with William often there, a sense of invasion overwhelmed me. Her increasing dominance in our household coincided with my growing resolve to reclaim my space, my dignity, and my life. I started finding excuses to refuse Isa's overnight stays, each refusal a small assertion of my need for boundaries, for a semblance of normalcy in what had become an increasingly abnormal relationship. Yet, despite my efforts, the situation seemed only to worsen, Isa's presence a constant reminder of the struggle I faced to maintain my identity and autonomy within my own home. I felt my heart sink as William's casual dismissal of my most cherished possessions echoed through the now sparse living room. His words, that dirty junk? I got rid of it, it was always in the way. Today was bulk trash day, so. reverberated like a physical blow, a clear and cruel indicator of how little he valued not just the items themselves, but what they represented to me. The shock left me momentarily paralyzed. These weren't just objects, they were tangible connections to my family, to a life and love that existed before William. The bookshelf my brother had painstakingly crafted during his school days, the painting my mother had lovingly framed, the souvenirs my father had collected from his travels, all were pieces of my history, of my identity. The ring and pendant from my mother were more than just jewelry, they were symbols of her blessing and presence in my life, especially poignant since she couldn't attend our wedding. Standing there, in the stripped room, the magnitude of what had happened began to settle in. William had unilaterally decided to erase these physical manifestations of my family from our home, treating them as mere clutter. This act was more than just a violation of my personal space, it was a blatant disregard for my feelings and attachments. "William, how could you?" I managed to say, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rising anger. Those were not just any items, they were precious gifts from my family. How could you throw them away without even asking me? William's reaction was a shrug, a nonchalant gesture that only fueled my growing despair and outrage. "It's just stuff, Emily. Besides, we needed to make room. This place was getting crowded, and honestly, it looked better without all that old stuff cluttering it up." His words stung, his complete lack of empathy or understanding was appalling. It dawned on me that this was not just an isolated incident but a reflection of a much deeper issue in our relationship. William's priorities were clear, and they did not include me or my feelings. His mother's influence was pervasive, affecting not just his decisions about our living arrangements and finances, but now encroaching into the very personal realms of my life. As the reality of our situation settled in, so did a profound sense of clarity. This was not the partnership I had envisioned when I married William. I had hoped for a shared life, one built on mutual respect and understanding. Instead, I found myself in a marriage where my feelings were consistently overlooked, and my history was discarded as easily as household rubbish. For the first time since we had gotten married, the thought of divorce transformed from a distant, unacknowledged whisper to a real, tangible option. Could I really continue in a relationship where I felt so undervalued and dismissed? The absence of my family's items made the house feel emptier, but it also made my next steps seem clearer. I needed to consider my own happiness and well-being, potentially outside the confines of this marriage. The hurt and betrayal lingered as I processed William's actions and their implications. It was a defining moment, one that would undoubtedly shape the decisions I would make about my future. As I stood amidst the remnants of what had been my past, I knew that whatever my decision, it needed to affirm my worth and respect, qualities painfully absent in my current situation. As William stood there, his words echoing around the increasingly cold, empty spaces of what used to feel like our shared home, I found myself at a loss for words. His blatant disrespect not only for my belongings, but for my family as well, left me reeling. The hurt was palpable, a sharp sting that seemed to resonate deeper with each passing moment. His attempt to coerce me into acceptance with a pre-filled divorce application was not just shocking, but deeply revealing of the dynamics that had come to define our marriage. It was a calculated move, likely orchestrated by his mother, to push me to the brink, to test my limits of endurance. Perhaps he thought presenting me with divorce papers would scare me into subservience, to silence, to compliance. But as I looked at the document, something within me shifted fundamentally. "Mommy is moving in next month, clean out your room," William repeated, his voice imbued with a false authority that he seemed to borrow from his mother. His insistence on clearing out my personal space was a metaphor for what our marriage had become, him trying to erase my identity, my past, and my family's heritage. His words, "It might have been your house originally, but now it's my house too. If you don't like it, we can just get divorced," were meant to intimidate, to finalize his claim over my life and my space. But they did not have the effect he intended. Instead of feeling cornered, I felt clarity. It was as if his ultimatum had finally freed me from the continuous cycle of hope and disappointment. Standing there, facing William and the stark reality he presented, I realized that this was not about saving a marriage or reclaiming a house. It was about salvaging my self-respect and dignity. The man I had married, who once spoke of the importance of family, now couldn't see beyond the narrow confines of his allegiance to his mother. The pain of the betrayal was deep, but it also catalyzed a resolve within me that I hadn't felt in months. The home that once held memories of laughter, love, and family was now just a battleground. I could not live in a place where every corner was a reminder of lost dreams and a love that turned out to be conditional, dependent not on mutual respect, but on compliance to another's whims. As William waited for my response, his demeanor confident that his manipulation would yield submission, I found my voice. "I'm not going to clean out anything. This is my home, my sanctuary, and I won't be bulldozed into erasing my existence from it. If a divorce is what it takes to regain my peace and freedom, then maybe that's the path I need to take." His face registered surprise, perhaps the first genuine emotion I had seen in a long time. He had underestimated my resolve, my strength. The situation was heartbreakingly clear. This marriage, built on what I thought were shared values and mutual respect, was nothing more than a facade, maintained for the convenience of appearances and the satisfaction of his mother's control over his life. As I stared at the divorce papers, I no longer saw them as a symbol of defeat but as a possible doorway to a new beginning, one where I could rebuild, away from the oppressive shadow of ISA and the twisted loyalty William had to her. It was a daunting prospect, the idea of starting over, but I realized that anything was better than remaining trapped in a life where I was valued less than the furniture. I remember the shock in William's voice as he processed the reality of the empty lot where our house once stood. "You're insane. Where's the furniture, my stuff, where did it go?" His words were filled with disbelief, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Everything was mine before we married," I replied calmly, the clarity of my decision strengthening with each word. "I sold the furniture and household items. And as for your belongings, they're all safely stored in the shed you built for your bikes, the one thing you seem to care about more than us." His silence on the other end of the phone was palpable. For a moment, I could almost hear his mind racing, trying to piece together the shattered image of the control he thought he had over me and our life together. This was not just a physical dismantling of our shared home, but a definitive end to a marriage that had been suffocating under the weight of his and his mother's dominance. William's feeble attempt to regain some semblance of authority came through hesitantly. "But, Emily, that was our home, how could you just get rid of it like that?" I felt a surge of empowerment as I answered, "You told me to clean everything out completely, William. I just followed your instructions. You were so eager to make space for your mother, to erase my presence. Well, now you have all the space you could want." The realization of the finality of my actions began to sink in for both of us. For William, it was the loss of the physical home and the last vestiges of the life he had tried to control. For me, it was a cathartic release from the years of being marginalized in my own marriage, a bold stroke to reclaim my life and assert my independence. "You can't just. I mean, where will I go?" William's voice cracked, the reality of his situation finally dawning on him. "That's something you'll have to figure out with your mother," I said, a hint of finality in my tone. "You've always placed her first, so I'm sure you'll find a solution together." As I hung up the phone, a profound sense of relief. The decision to sell the house might have been drastic, but it was a necessary step to free myself from an untenable situation. I had endured enough manipulation and disrespect, and with the house sold and the divorce papers likely to be finalized soon, I was finally closing this painful chapter of my life. Turning from the echoes of the call, I looked around at the few belongings I had decided to keep. Each item was a piece of me, things I cherished, reminders of who I was before and who I was becoming. The future was uncertain, undoubtedly filled with challenges as I rebuilt my life from the ground up. But for the first time in a long while, it was a future that felt like my own, unshadowed by the oppressive presence of William and his mother. As I prepared to leave the shed, I took one last look at the bikes and the other remnants of William's life stored there. They were his now to deal with as he saw fit. I stepped out into the sunlight, a free woman, ready to start anew, my spirits lifted not just by the act of liberation but by the promise of what lay ahead. Isa's voice crackled with anger and disbelief through the phone, her tone shifting as she grasped the implications of my words. "You can't do this, Emily. You have to give us something. That's your duty." My duty was to respect myself and exit a situation where I was not valued or respected, I responded firmly. "As for the distribution of property, the law is quite clear. The items you're referring to were mine before the marriage. William has not contributed financially to them, and thus they are not considered marital property. You're mistaken if you think there's anything to claim." There was a pause, the kind that fills a conversation with tension so thick it feels almost tangible. Then Isa's voice, now tinged with a frantic edge, returned. "But the shed? That shed William built must be worth something. We deserve a portion of that." "The shed, yes," I agreed, my voice steady, "was built with William's money. That, you can have. It's the only thing from our marriage that William truly invested in, so it's all yours. Take the shed, take whatever's in it. It's isolated from the property that's been sold, so there shouldn't be any legal issues with you claiming it." Isa's fury seemed to cool into a calculated silence as she processed the information. Then, with a sharp inhale, she said, "We will take the shed then. And you'll hear from our lawyers about the divorce and everything else." "That's fine, Isa. I've consulted my own lawyer and everything is in order," I replied, feeling a sense of closure washing over me. "Please ensure that you remove the shed at your earliest convenience. The land has new owners, and I would hate for any legal complications to arise that would make this more unpleasant than it needs to be." The conversation ended abruptly, with Isa hanging up the phone in a mix of frustration and defeat. I stood there for a moment, phone in hand, reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had led to this point. I had stood up for myself, taken decisive action to protect my interests, and now, finally, it seemed that this chapter of my life was closing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard where the shed stood, a small monument to a marriage that was built on uneven ground. Soon, it would be dismantled, just as the rest of my ties to William and Isa. The irony of the shed being the sole remnant of our union was not lost on me. It stood there, filled with things William valued over our relationship, a fitting legacy of his priorities. As I walked back into my now peaceful home, the weight of the past year seemed to lift. I was free from the oppressive influence of Isa and the stifling indifference of William. I had my dignity, my freedom, and a clear conscience. The legal proceedings that would finalize the divorce were merely formalities now. Looking ahead, I felt a renewed sense of optimism. I was once again in control of my life, my home, and my future. The lessons learned were hard but invaluable, and as I moved forward, I knew I was stronger for them. The end of this marriage was not just an ending but a beginning, a chance to rebuild on my own terms, respectful of my values and true to myself. Hearing William's crying and Isa's soothing words on the phone, a part of me wanted to just hang up and disconnect from the entire situation forever. However, knowing that there were still loose ends to tie up, I remained on the call, a decision that reinforced my resolve to see this painful chapter of my life fully closed. "Emily, you can't just leave us in the dark. We need to sort this out," Isa pleaded, her tone shifting between commanding and desperate. "I think everything that needed to be said has been expressed, Isa," I replied, my voice steady despite the churn of emotions. "As for William, he should have thought about the consequences before acting. My lawyer will be in touch with you regarding the divorce and the terms of the settlement." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by William's intermittent sobs. I could almost picture Isa, hovering over him, hand ready to cover his mouth should he say anything more damaging. It was an image that spoke volumes about the dynamics I had escaped. I gathered all necessary evidence of the infidelity, I continued, ensuring there was no room for misunderstanding. The photos, along with testimony from acquaintances, will be more than sufficient in court. As for the woman involved, she too will be addressed in the legal proceedings. Isa seemed to find her voice again, her tone edged with a sharp bitterness. "You're being unreasonable, Emily. Can't we settle this amicably? Why drag this through the mud? Amicable was never an option once adultery was involved, I replied. And given the circumstances, it's only right to follow through legally. It's not just about retribution, it's about setting the record straight and ensuring fairness. William's voice, broken and feeble, came through once more. Emily, please, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It's too late for apologies, William. Actions have consequences, and you chose yours, I said, feeling a finality with each word. I hope you reflect on your choices and their impact on the people around you. As I ended the call, the weight of the entire ordeal seemed to momentarily lift, only to settle back with a realization of the legal battles that lay ahead. Yet, despite the looming challenges, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief and empowerment. I had taken the necessary steps to protect my interests and dignity, and now I was ready to rebuild and move forward on my own terms. The next steps involved contacting my lawyer to finalize the strategy for the divorce proceedings and ensuring all documentation was in order. As I organized the evidence, the photos of William and the woman, the recordings of our conversations, I knew that these would serve as strong foundations for my case. The path ahead would not be easy, but I was prepared, supported by undeniable proof and a clear moral stance. Reflecting on the entire journey from the day I met William to this pivotal moment, I realized how much I had grown. From the loving, hopeful bride to a determined, self-respecting individual facing her estranged husband's betrayal, every step, though painful, had sculpted a stronger version of myself. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the hardest decision, leaving a toxic marriage, was already behind me. As I walked towards the boarding gate, the hum of the airport around me seemed to echo the whirlwind of events that had led me to this moment. The heaviness that had clung to my steps for so long felt lighter now, knowing that I was leaving behind not just a physical place, but a chapter of my life filled with turmoil and deceit. I had done everything I could to ensure justice was served. ISA's theft of my precious ring and pendant, gifts from my family that were meant to symbolize love and heritage, had been the final breach of trust. The evidence of her wearing them during her trip with William, seemingly flaunting her disregard for anything but her desires, had sealed her fate in many ways. Not only had I reported her actions to the police, but I had also informed her husband. The reaction from William's father had been swift and decisive. He, too, had seen enough of ISA's manipulative ways, and his decision to divorce her marked the end of her influence over their family. Looking out the window, watching planes ascend and disappear into the sky, I reflected on the outcome for William and ISA. They were now living in a small apartment, a significant change from the life of comfort they were used to. William's resignation from his job, prompted by the formal notice of his infidelity, and the subsequent part-time jobs they both had to take up, were consequences they had to live with. The protective bubble that ISA had created around William had burst, revealing the harsh realities they had avoided for so long. The shed, too, was gone. The land where my house once stood was now just an empty lot, soon to be filled with new life and new memories by others. It felt fitting that something new and hopefully joyful would sprout from a place that had held so much sadness for me. Rolling my carry-on, I felt a surge of excitement mixed with relief. I was about to reunite with my family, to embrace them and share stories of survival and new beginnings. The distance I had put between myself and my past in that country was a physical manifestation of the emotional and mental journey I had undergone. I was not just traveling to a new location, I was moving towards a future that I had chosen, one where respect, love, and honesty were the foundations. As I approached the boarding gate, passport and boarding pass in hand, the sense of freedom was overwhelming. I was not running away from my past, but rather walking confidently towards a future where I could be myself, unencumbered by the shadows of deceit and manipulation. The lessons learned were painful yet invaluable, forging a version of myself that was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Stepping onto the plane, I found my seat by the window, buckled myself in, and looked out at the runway, ready for takeoff. The journey ahead was both literal and metaphorical, a flight not just across oceans but across the boundaries of my old life into a new reality. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its ascent, I closed my eyes and imagined the warm embrace of my family, the genuine smiles, and the unconditional love waiting for me. It was a new beginning,